southern suburb of Beirut, which is a Hezbollah stronghold. This protest has been organized by Hezbollah in response to the hospital explosion in Gaza yesterday. And we're here near the women's section of the protest, next to the stage, where thousands of men behind this section. Lots of people here carrying the Palestinian flag, also the yellow and green flag of Hezbollah. Now, this protest is happening also on the day that US President Joe Biden is visiting Israel in a demonstration of American support for Israel. So there is a very strong anti-American and anti-Israeli sentiment here. Now, of course, in Lebanon, lots of people want to know what Hezbollah is going to do if this country is going to be dragged into this conflict. We've seen that in the last few days, violence along the Lebanese-Israeli border has intensified. Today there was more exchange of fire between militants here in Lebanon and the Israeli army. So a lot of people are paying attention to what Hezbollah and also its main supporter, Iran, will decide to do next.
That's our correspondent Hugo Bishega there in Beirut.
Joe Biden coming to Tel Aviv to try to get some kind of aid corridor established for the people of Gaza. He's also been talking about the situation concerning that horrific blast yesterday in the territory, in which it's believed hundreds of people may have died during a blast at a hospital. We're going to get more from Jeremy Bowen on President Biden's visit in a few moments, but first we're going to get the very latest from Gaza. Our correspondent Rushdie Abu Alouf has been to the scene of that hospital blast, and a warning, some of the pictures in his report could be distressing.
When I arrived to the hospital this morning, they were still collecting the dead. After what looks to have been the deadliest moment we have seen so far in Gaza. There were burnt out cars after a huge fire following last night's blast. I was talking to the one of the people who witnessed this, what the Palestinians are calling massacre. He said that they were just sitting in the garden peacefully, and suddenly huge explosion rocked this area. He said we collecting bodies, injured people. We evacuated serious injuries using a motorcycle. Some of people like evacuated on foot. He said from here to Shifa hospital. Blood-soaked mattresses lay on the ground. As we picked our way through the devastation, bread scattered, aimed wreckage. Children's backpacks and collapsed tent where people had been sleeping. Doctors told us thousands were seeking shelters at the hospital when it happened. Eyewitnesses said the hospital ground were packed with people living under siege and under fire. People are still collecting body pieces from on the ground. People are still in panic. People are still trying to understand what's happened. Fear, grief, and anger.
My message to the world: stand up for the right thing. Don't be afraid of the Americans. Don't be afraid of the Israeli air forces. We will continue this fight until the last drop of blood.
Health officials here are saying hundreds are dead, injured, and missing. This is the moment of horror for Palestinians, already traumatized by this war. Rushdie Abu Alouf, BBC News, Gaza City.
Well, Israel has maintained it was not responsible. Producing evidence today, it suggests shows a misfiring rocket from a Palestinian group was to blame. President Biden, on his trip to Tel Aviv for talks, agreed, saying it appears the blast was done by the other team. Many in the Arab world, however, remain unconvinced, and there have been demonstrations by thousands of people across the Middle East. It's been a rare day of hope for the people of Gaza, with Joe Biden saying he secured aid to the territory via Egypt, bringing in much needed food, water and medicine for hundreds of thousands of people. They've been fleeing their homes to escape Israeli bombing targeting members of Hamas, a group designated as a terror organization by the UK government and responsible for the deaths of around 1,400 people in attacks on southern Israel 11 days ago. Let's get the very latest on Joe Biden's visit from Jeremy Bowen, and a warning, some details in his report you may find distressing.
A car park outside the Al Ahli hospital became a killing ground. The arguments about who's responsible come too late for the people whose lives ended here. Even with their bodies taken away, the cleanup this morning also meant collecting small pieces of flesh. God have mercy, he said. They were civilians. And Mohammed al-Sawafari, a neighbor, can't unsee children with legs blown off and the bodies he helped carry. They all, he said, thought they'd be safe near a hospital. Early this morning at the Defense Ministry in Tel Aviv, the military presented data it said proved Israel did not attack the hospital. Instead, they said it was a malfunctioning rocket fired by Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
The trajectory analysis from the barrage of rockets confirms that the rockets were fired close proximity to the hospital. According to our intelligence, Hamas checked the reports, understood it was an Islamic Jihad rocket that had misfired, and decided to launch a global media campaign to hide what really happened. They went as far as inflating the numbers of casualties.
Coming to Tel Aviv was a gamble for President Biden. He wanted to ease Gaza's humanitarian catastrophe while supporting Israel's war effort, perhaps an impossible circle to square with Israel's leader, Benjamin Netanyahu. But a deal emerged from their meeting. Food, water, and medicine, but no fuel from Egypt to Gaza. For Israel, more military aid and agreement that they didn't hit the hospital.
And based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you. I wanted to personally come and make that clear. Thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to having a thorough discussion about where everybody goes from here.
The president won't change the minds of those who insist Israel attacked the hospital. Joe Biden's presence here will only deepen the conviction among Palestinians and millions of other Arabs that America isn't just on Israel's side, but that it's also complicit in everything Israel is doing in Gaza, including killing civilians. Until the Hamas attacks on Israel, President Biden dreamt of transforming the Middle East. The Americans were negotiating with Saudi Arabia and Israel to try to get the two countries to recognize each other. That is not on the agenda anymore. In Arab capitals, there have been protests against Israel. This was Beirut, and this is Sana'a in Yemen. So far, the shouting has spread, but not the fighting. Keeping it that way will be a challenge. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Israel.
Well, as you saw there, President Biden said in that news conference with Benjamin Netanyahu that he believes the hospital blast wasn't the result of an Israeli airstrike. But he did acknowledge there were a lot of people out there who aren't so sure. Caroline Hawley has spent the day with the BBC's Verified team looking at what we know about the explosion.
Ever since the explosion happened at around 7 p.m. local time last night, BBC verification experts have been poring over all the images that have emerged. Israel says it was a failed rocket launch by the Palestinian group Islamic Jihad. These pictures appear to show the car park of the hospital in flames. We've been able to establish it's a courtyard with cars parked in it from the shape of the buildings. Now, the Al Jazeera television station was broadcasting live from Gaza at the time, and you see a bright light in the air that looks like a rocket. Now, we don't know where it was fired from, but something appears to happen to it. And then a few seconds later, there's a flash and then an enormous fireball. Our verification teams have looked at these images and they can tell from the roofs, from the placing of solar panels and from some trees that it was in the main courtyard of the hospital. Now we have some images by daylight this morning with a clearer picture emerging of the extent of the damage. Here you see cars that have been burnt in the fireball, and here there's even an upturned vehicle. But just a few damaged tiles on the roof of one of the buildings, and experts say that doesn't suggest a massive explosion. There's also a relatively small crater from the impact of whatever came into the courtyard area. Here's that crater from a different angle. We showed these images to a number of weapons experts, and while they couldn't come to a firm conclusion, several said if the incident had been caused by the type of bomb that's normally used by Israel, the crater would have been bigger with more damage to the buildings. In this picture you see windows blown out, but this hospital building closer to the crater is still standing. Now, one way of trying to establish what hit this hospital is by studying bomb or missile fragments at the scene. But a BBC team visited the hospital and didn't find any. And then here's an image we found last night of men searching the crater. The logo on their vests is from the Palestinian police, the Explosive Ordnance Unit. We don't know what, if anything, they recovered. The Islamic Jihad movement said the explosion was caused by Israeli aerial bombing and claimed that they have the remnants of the explosive head, but they haven't yet provided any evidence. What's not in dispute is that there were mass casualties at the hospital. To establish the exact truth of what caused this, you'd need an independent investigation, but that's very unlikely to happen in what is an active war zone.
Caroline Hawley reporting there. Well, President Biden has agreed with Israel's version of events, having looked at the evidence, but there were also words of caution for this country, because he made it clear that Israelis should not be consumed by their anger following last week's attack on the south of the country. He spoke of how, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, for instance, America too was enraged, but made mistakes. With Israel widely expected to launch a ground invasion in the coming days into northern Gaza, Lucy Williamson now has been gauging the mood among Israelis.
Israel is getting ready. Its target, Hamas. These drills include training in methods that avoid civilian casualties. But Israel knows any battle in Gaza will be messy. A tip today from the US president: government anger shouldn't replace the rules of war. In Ofakim, fear shows up as empty houses, empty pavements. Around 50 people were killed here. The mayor says they get 1,000 calls a night from residents who think they hear gunmen moving around. 18-year-old Daniel says Israel is now a country of grief. He lost a close friend in the attack 2 months before he starts his military service.
Now, I don't believe anything any politician says until they put their words into action. People are afraid to leave their homes. If Israel put down her weapon, the Palestinians would kill us. If the Palestinians put down their weapons, we could make peace with them.
The trauma left by these attacks is pressing on Israel's government. It says protecting its citizens means destroying Hamas. Warnings from friends, enemies and neighbours on the risks of that goal are outweighed by pressure at home.
Not more than one salad in a bowl. Now we need to
Sharon used to cook dinner for Tel Aviv's elite. Now it's fuel for soldiers at the front. A far-left, anti-government protester, he paused his criticism to support the war. Now there's a new opponent and a new national unity.
We need to choose now between our kids to their kids, and who's right now.
What do you mean?
I said Churchill bombed Berlin. He didn't ask who voted to Hitler, right? So we have a war against the country. We have the right to fight them.
The families of some of the hostages held in Gaza appealed to President Biden today. They say war is not the first priority. Israelis caught between the trauma of their wounded nation and the trauma of wondering if their loved ones will survive. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Southern Israel.
Let's return to Jeremy, who's in southern Israel. Jeremy, words of encouragement and caution, it has to be said, for the Israelis from Joe Biden today, but also potentially words of hope for the people of Gaza, with the possibility of aid flowing into the territory. How effective do you think the president has been today?
Well, the president, I think, took a gamble coming here, and he's able to go home with things to his credit, which he can then present and say, look, I think the trip was well worth it. Top of that agenda is, I think, the fact that the humanitarian corridor appears to have a chance now of working out of Gaza. Food, water, medicine going into the south, not fuel, which is what they need for hospital generators, pumping water, that kind of thing. And also, I don't know how much will be coming in and whether it will percolate its way right up the Gaza Strip. I think in normal times, Gaza got about 600 or 700 trucks per day of food. They won't be getting that much. Israel also says that if they think any of this is going to Hamas, they will thwart that. I think what that means is they'll probably close the gates. But yes, it's better for Palestinian civilians than it was. No question about that. But, you know, longer term, it's not going to end what aid workers there and the UN have called a humanitarian catastrophe. I think it's going to dilute it, but it's not going to end it.
No. Okay. Jeremy, thank you. Jeremy Bowen there in southern Israel.
The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is expected to travel to Israel shortly. Today in the House of Commons, he told MPs that they should not rush to judgment about the hospital explosion and that British intelligence is working rapidly to analyse the evidence and establish the facts. Our political editor, Chris Mason, is in Westminster for us. And what more are Downing Street saying?
Well, publicly, Sophie, there is no announcement about the Prime Minister's travel plans. Clearly, there are lots of security considerations for them to weigh up and diplomatic considerations too about where they visit and when. And such is the nature of the events on the ground, as we've just been seeing, there is every chance that plans could change before any departure or indeed after the Prime Minister has set off. But don't be surprised if we see him in the region tomorrow. The Foreign Secretary James Cleverly is already heading back out there this evening, and we've learnt today that we now know 7 British nationals were killed in the Hamas attacks in Israel earlier this month. 9 are missing, some feared dead. Others thought to be having been taken hostage in Gaza. We can expect the focus of these political visits to be on supporting British families, humanitarian support more widely, and then diplomatic conversations about trying to reduce the prospect of an escalation of conflict in the region. As for the politics here, a very sombre Prime Minister's questions at lunchtime today. Near total agreement, really, between Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, and Rishi Sunak. The Scottish National Party, they are calling for a ceasefire, and tonight there are 30 Labour backbenchers who have joined them in expressing that desire. The official position of both the government and the Labour front bench is not to call for a ceasefire and to say that Israel does have the right to defend itself. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, I think, will be wanting to make a diplomatic effort pretty soon, given the likelihood of Israeli escalation in the coming days.
Our political editor, Chris Mason, thank you.
The words may offer a glimpse of hope, but in this region reeling from this catastrophe unfolding in the Gaza Strip, and which has been compounded by that devastating explosion at Al Ali Hospital in Gaza City, a scene of such carnage and chaos. What the Palestinians say is the highest casualty toll from a single strike in 5 different Hamas, Gaza and Israeli wars. They don't trust Israel. They don't buy the account presented by Israel that it did not carry out an airstrike against that hospital. It doesn't buy the American account that they too have looked at all the evidence and believe that Israel didn't do it, that it was the result of a misfired missile by Palestinian Jihad. President Biden took care to say that while he was standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel and wanted to be seen to be doing so, he also said that Palestinians are suffering too. And yes, he seems to have got that agreement from Israel to allow aid to come in from Egypt. But Egypt will have its own concerns. It has said repeatedly it won't open the Rafah crossing, the only way in and out of Gaza right now, unless security can be assured. A crossing which has come under Israeli airstrikes 4 times ever since October the 7th. So, as always, it depends on what happens on the ground, not the words which are spoken. But let's take a look at another extraordinary day across this region and this unprecedented visit by an American president at a time of war here in Israel and across the border in the Gaza Strip. I'll warn you that this report by Weira Davis has some images which can be distressing. But here's his report on a day of all days.
Joe Biden arrived in Israel this morning at one of the most dangerous points in the recent history of the region. From the US president, a very public, demonstrative show of support for Israel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has vowed to do what it takes to crush Hamas. Mr. Biden's visit has been overshadowed by what Palestinian officials say was an Israeli attack last night on a hospital in Gaza. According to Hamas, 500 people were killed, including many who'd already been forced to evacuate their homes and were sheltering in the now burnt-out hospital grounds. As the victims were buried, more desperation for Gazans and a sense of increasing anger across the Arab world. There were overnight protests in the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon and Yemen. But Israel says it was not to blame. In a detailed rebuttal of the claims from Gaza, Israeli officials said intelligence reports pointed to a misfired missile from Palestinian militants.
This is not in infrared.
Part of Israel's defense, intercepted communication between militants, said to be acknowledging what had actually happened. Israel's evidence appeared persuasive enough for Joe Biden.
I was deeply saddened and outraged by the explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday. And based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you.
And he was going to start in...
Mr. Biden also expressed concern about hostages held in Gaza. They include US citizen Hirsch Goldberg Polin. The 23-year-old was badly wounded in the Hamas attack at a music festival in which hundreds were killed. Hirsch's mother, Rachel, is desperate for progress.
I do feel that President Biden is very much with the hostages. We've spoken to him. I've spoken to him personally. We feel that support. And I know that the Israelis as well want all the hostages released. And yet there's this quagmire of time and chaos and pandemonium, and we are actively at war right now.
Joe Biden's short visit will be followed by other world leaders, many of whom also have citizens killed or abducted by Hamas. But the events of the last 24 hours have made things even more perilous for people in the immediate region, including the hostages being held in Gaza. Weira Davis, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Well, today in his short but important visit here to Israel, President Biden at moments rose to poetry, and he also invoked the lessons that Americans had learned from their own history. He talked, as Israel has as well, about the attacks of September 11th in the United States in 2001, saying that what had happened in Israel was like 15 9/11s. But he also urged the Israelis to learn from what the American mistakes were in response to that atrocity and not to act in rage.
Justice must be done. But I caution this: while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it. After 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. While we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes.
His words will have been clutched by many here in Israel. They will have been listened to in the Palestinian territories and right across the Arab world, and of course back in America. But it is the concrete achievements he's been able to achieve here while on the ground that will matter most. Most of all, getting aid into the Gaza Strip at a time when the United Nations Secretary General has spoken of epic suffering. Here's what the American president had to say about that.
Today I asked the Israeli cabinet, who I met with for some time this morning, to agree to the delivery of life-saving humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza, based on the understanding that there will be inspections and that the aid should go to civilians, not to Hamas. Israel agreed the humanitarian assistance can begin to move from Egypt to Gaza. But let me be clear, if Hamas diverts or steals the assistance, they will have demonstrated once again that they have no concern for the welfare of the Palestinian people.
President Biden making clear the conditions on that aid, that everyone will be watching now to see whether it does indeed come from Egypt into the southern Gaza Strip.
I want to start first of all with Joe Biden's visit to Israel. He was there just 8 hours. Has it made any difference?
Well, he was initially supposed to meet with Arab leaders, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Palestinians, in a quadrilateral summit in Amman. But it seems as though those Arab leaders have decided not to meet with President Biden. I think primarily because they are unhappy with the U.S. position. The distance between the U.S. position and that of the Arab states seems to be large and insurmountable. The U.S. President Biden has arrived in Israel with a message of total and blanket solidarity. And I suspect that Israel will see this as cover to undertake further military operations that will lead to further loss of life among the Palestinians in Gaza. Let's also remember that the U.S. has recently shot down a draft resolution at the UN Security Council calling for a ceasefire, and has, over the past few hours, I believe, also been the only nation within the UN Security Council to oppose a draft resolution calling for humanitarian pauses. So I think the American message to Israel is very clear, and that is to say, carry on, we are unconditionally by your side.
Yes, and I want to talk about the implications of that, because all of the rhetoric has been exactly that: total solidarity, unequivocal support, unconditional support. You touched on it there, the fact that that could embolden Israel in its actions and what happens next. I wonder, though, does there come a point when that rhetoric starts to change? That's why that attack on the hospital and trying to get to the bottom of who was responsible was so important and such an important part of this trip, because it did threaten to overshadow the visit, and it could, in some respects, change the way that America sees this war.
Well, yes, and the U.S. and President Biden's statement on this issue is not very credible. The U.S. is not an impartial party here. President Biden has already said that he fully supports Israel, and I think the Americans realize very well what the international implications could be if it is in fact the case that, which I think is probable, based on the evidence that is already out there, that Israel did conduct the strike on the hospital. The US president has, in the past, repeated false propaganda and has had to retract it. And in fact, this is not the first incident of Israeli bombardment hitting health facilities in Gaza. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights yesterday released a statement that mentioned, and I quote, numerous health facilities hit by bombardment, end quote. So there is a pattern of airstrikes, whether intentionally or unintentionally, targeting and hitting health facilities in the Gaza Strip, not to mention the fact that there were testimonies by the managers of that hospital in question, which claimed that they received evacuation orders by the Israeli military prior to the strike.
Yes, and it's interesting you say that President Biden citing sources. We don't know what those sources are right now. He says that he's seen data from the US Defense Department that would back up Israel's strong denial of any involvement in that. One would assume that the international community now wants to see that evidence.
Most certainly. And it will also be possible for analysis of open source material. There is video footage of the strike. There is aftermath analysis that can be conducted. So there is a possibility of conducting analysis of this kind of open source material that could also help corroborate and uncover the truth about this incident. And of course, I mean, the US, if it has evidence, then it should very well make it public at this stage.
We know we've seen protests. We've seen those images of protests in many cities around the world, but particularly in the Arab world. Give me a sense of what this does or what risk this poses in the longer term for the United States, but also the danger that this drags other players into this conflict. We heard the rhetoric from Joe Biden. He said, don't, any actor that is thinking of attacking Israel, he said. Will that be listened to? Will that be heard in some Arab countries?
Well, the risk of escalation is most certainly present. We've seen Hezbollah announce a day of unprecedented anger as a result of the bombing of the Al Arab hospital. And we've already seen Iraqi militias launch drone and UAV attacks against US forces in the Al-Assad airbase in Iraq. And so the risk of escalation is ever present, and it increases with every day that this fighting goes on, and with every day that we see more civilian casualties. The Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, have already also taken a very strong position on this issue. They have totally refused any mass displacement, and they have totally rejected any plans for a mass displacement of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. It seems that at the moment, Israel seems intent on bringing about permanent demographic and topographic change in the Gaza Strip. And this is something that the Egyptians and Jordanians seem to realize very well. This strategy of depriving civilians in Gaza of food, water, electricity, and fuel, threatening to bomb humanitarian convoys, targeting of civil defense and aid workers, which is something that the UN has also pointed to, seems intended to create an infernal situation that would force the Palestinians to pile up in the southern portion of Gaza, but then ultimately to force a mass displacement through the southern border with Egypt. And this is something that I think the Egyptians know very well. And the objective here seems to be to radically and permanently alter Hamas's operating environment, essentially through the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. And then going in, seeking to destroy Hamas's military capabilities through a ground incursion and claim a permanent victory against the group, even if at the price of a permanent and total change in Gaza's demographics. This seems to be the strategy at the moment. And I think Jordan and Egypt have taken a very strong position to say that they would not be in a position to host 2 million Gazan refugees.
Let's return to what we've been watching with Joe Biden and that visit. Diplomacy doesn't come much tougher than this, does it?
It does not, and we're fortunate in the United States, I believe, to have President Biden at the helm at this point, a very experienced leader, diplomat, with the security interests of the United States, frankly, first and foremost, and also what is most important to democracy, small d, in the United States and around the world, also at the front of his mind.
The hospital explosion made this trip, everything about it, so much harder. But does that mean it is a real success, apparently getting an agreement on allowing aid in to Gaza? We haven't seen it happen, but we are told it will happen.
I believe, and again, as your newscasters pointed out, we need to see on the ground to know for sure. But I believe that this visit will represent a breakthrough on humanitarian aid getting in. And it is something, as you know, the United States and many others have been working hard to facilitate over the past days. It's critical for any number of reasons for the many innocents in Gaza who are having such a difficult time. And that's an understatement right now. But food, water, fuel need to make entry, and foreign nationals at the minimum need to have routes out. And I believe for President Biden, that was a top component, top goal of this trip, that he saw that he needed to be in person to have some of these discussions to have this go forward. One other note, though, is he did warn about Hamas skimming off the top, taking these supplies for their own use. Having worked in the region for some period of time, I would fully expect, and I think we need to expect, this has always been Hamas's behavior of skimming off the top, taking first, and leaving what is left for the many innocent civilians in Gaza.
So that could still be a very big problem in the days and weeks ahead. We heard in the last hour or so from the UN Middle East peace envoy saying that they fear that we're on the brink of a deep, dangerous abyss that could change the trajectory of Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, if not the Middle East as a whole. In terms of your reflections, do you think that is where we are? It is that dangerous?
I wouldn't use those words. I think we are walking along the edge of a precipice. And so each step needs to be taken with incredible care. And doing so in a way that Israel both has the ability to defend itself and prevent Hamas militants, terrorists from taking further action against them in the ways that occurred last weekend, and at the same time, to the fullest extent possible, minimizing the damage for the many innocent civilians, Palestinians and Israelis alike. And that's an extraordinarily difficult line to walk, but it is the path that Israel is on, and the path that the world community is on, is navigating that very difficult path.